Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming to our institution. It's nice to see you all. As we many times said, the view is great, sometimes the weather is not. Um, I'm Jack Klieger. I'm President and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's screening and discussion of First to Stand, Upstanders Fighting for Justice. Here at the museum, we're dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. And our mission, as is the work that is done by the people in this film, is, in my opinion, more critical than ever. Tonight's film focuses on Irwin Cotler and his team of activists at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre in Montreal as they take on the cases and causes of political prisoners and human rights activists against the world's most repressive regimes. Many of the themes in the film resonate with those found in our museum's exhibitions, two major exhibitions. One is The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, and the other that we just recently opened is Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark. We hope you'll come back to the museum to view our exhibitions, particularly on Sunday, Family Day, which is a lot of various activities here, and we're very proud to be able to do that. So, we're honored to be joined this evening by Irwin Cotler, Canadian Special Envoy to combat global anti-Semitism, Robert Ray, Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations, and Rick Solomon, co-founder of the Illinois Holocaust Museum, who will moderate the discussion conversation after the film. If you have questions of our speakers, we'd like you to write them down on the index cards you were given when you came into the room. Our staff will collect them, and then we will use them near the end of the discussion. That wasn't too hard to understand. That's it. Got it. We also ask that you turn off your cell phones at this time. Thank you so much for joining this evening, and now I can say one of my favorite words, roll them.
Round of applause for Irene Angelico, who is the director of the film with her husband, Abbey, who's going to say a few words, and then we'll do our panel.
My partner, Abbey Neidik, the co-director, co-producer, cinematographer, and co-editor, isn't here today because he had a very Canadian hockey injury, so he couldn't come. The first documentary we made together is called Dark Lullabies. It's about the reverberations of the Holocaust on the next generation of Jews and Germans. In Dark Lullabies, we ask the question, why didn't anybody do anything to stop it? And that's the question that led us 40 years later to do First to Stand, the cases and causes of Irwin Cotler. It's hard today to talk about anything beyond the unspeakable slaughter, Israel at war, the hostages still in captivity, and the rise of anti-Semitism, especially on college campuses in Canada and the United States. Last week on Capitol Hill, Professor Cotler received the Lantos Human Rights Prize. At the screening following the ceremony, I said I was glad my parents, both Holocaust survivors, did not see the crimes against Jews and against humanity that we are witnessing. My father was liberated by American troops in Dachau, and my mother by American troops in Magdeburg. They both loved America, and they would be proud today to see that the U.S. is standing with Israel. In these times, the message of the film, the message of Irwin Cotler, is as relevant as ever. We need to stand up with Israel against anti-Semitism and against all forms of hatred. Irwin Cotler is my hero for his lifetime of standing up against hatred and for justice for everyone, and now for standing up tirelessly to help free the hostages. It was an honor for Abbey and I to make this film with him, and we're looking forward to working together again on a series on anti-Semitism. I know many of you were expecting to hear Bill Browder speak with Professor Cotler tonight. Bill Browder is another human rights champion whose Magnitsky sanctions are one of the greatest human rights tools of the century. And as you saw in the film, it was passed first here in the United States, then in Canada, and now all over the world. I'm sad to tell you that he came down with the flu, just as he was about to come to New York, and sends his regrets and disappointment that he cannot be with us tonight. His are big shoes to fill, but we have the privilege of having someone who certainly can do that. Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray, will be introduced later, but I just wanted to say how honored we are to have you with us. In 1 month, we'll be celebrating the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt drafted the declaration with Chinese human rights activist P.C. Chang and Lebanese diplomat Charles Malik after she toured the refugee camps in post-war Europe. The idea was that never again would the international community allow atrocities like those in the Holocaust to happen. Let's hope that on the anniversary next month, we will also be celebrating the end of Hamas, that the end of war will be in sight, and the beginning of human rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Another round of applause for Irwin and Ambassador Ray. Is this microphone on? Okay. So before we get started, first I want to thank the Museum of Jewish Heritage, entire staff, Jack Klieger, and everyone for making this happen. I also want to note, like Irene did, literally over the weekend, Bill Browder wrote to me how he was ill. And it was touch and go. So that was a last minute change, and we're delighted to have the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, who's a wonderful statesman here. I also want to acknowledge someone who co-starred in the film, who's sitting in the first row, who's the head of programs and projects for the Raoul Wallenberg Centre. I'm going to ask Brandon Silver to please stand. So let's get started. Irwin, there's so many things to cover and so much to say. So I'm going to start with an easy question for both of you, which is there's really been, a massive resurgence in global authoritarianism. And I'm being facetious that it's a simple question, but how did we get here? Irwin first and then Bob.
It's interesting. The first words in the film that I speak about are that we are experiencing a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, assaults on human rights, and political prisoners as a looking glass. I did not anticipate when the excellent film that was made at the time by Irene and Abbey, that we would be in a situation 5 years later after they made the film that this is intensified, that this resurgent global authoritarianism is in fact metastasized. We speak in the film about Putin's Russia. That was before the criminal aggression in Ukraine. Anatoly Sharansky is represented there as a political prisoner. What is not so well known is that one of the architects of the Magnitsky sanctions, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who happens also to be a senior fellow at our Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, probably one of the persons most responsible, along with Bill Browder, for the global Magnitsky sanctions movement, a heroic Russian patriot, a leading Russian dissident, was recently sentenced to 25 years in prison for what? For telling the truth about Putin's both domestic repression and external aggression, which have dramatically worsened since then. Iran, and also featured in the film, Iran is part of this intensifying axis of evil. Irene mentioned Hamas, the country that has armed, trained, operated, financed, encouraged, and even celebrated Hamas is Iran. And as we're meeting today, we speak about Shaparak, the imprisoned, courageous Iranian woman. Well, just yesterday, Nasrin Sotoudeh, known as the Mandela of Iran, the iconic woman, human rights lawyer in Iran, whose case I first took up as a parliamentarian back in 2011. We launched then a massive campaign, internationalized advocacy. She was released after 3 years. She was then 5 years ago sentenced to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes, a virtual death sentence for a woman in her late 50s. And parenthetically, Iran was then elected 2 days later to the UN Commission on Women's Rights. After a strong advocacy campaign, they were removed. But as we are meeting now, and Bob knows this only too well, Iran has been elected the chair of the Social Forum of the UN Human Rights Council beginning tomorrow. And Nasrin Sotoudeh, yesterday, who had been on furlough, was rearrested and brutalized already in prison. So the question, I gave a bit of a longer backdrop to, I think part of the thing is because of what is also shown in the film, that we've had a culture of impunity and not a culture of accountability. That we don't have enough people like Bob Bray who stand up and are counted within and without the United Nations. And I want to say, and I say this publicly, it's a real privilege for me to sit here this evening with a person who is the best ambassador in the UN and the ambassador for human rights and international justice internationally. So Bob, we're delighted that you are with us this evening because your voice, your moral voice on both these issues that I just mentioned, on both the Russia's crime of aggression in Ukraine and with regard to Iran, Bob has been the most compelling voice on these issues, and as well in being an authentic voice in unmasking the criminality of Hamas. So I think the problem is that we have a metastasizing axis of evil, and we need a mobilizing community of democracies, and we need strong, moral, intellectual, principled political leadership. And that's the kind of leadership that Bob has been demonstrating, but there's been too little of that. And that is what I think has been sorely missing. I'll close with one example. Ibrahim Raisi is the president of Iran, but he began in 1988 as a member of the death squad, the Iranian government's death squad, responsible for the massacre of over 5,000 Iranian dissidents. He was then a deputy prosecutor in Iran. Was he held accountable? No. He was promoted to be Attorney General. As Attorney General, he presided over the largest per capita executions of any country. Was he held accountable? No. He then was appointed Chief Justice. As Chief Justice, he presided over the massive domestic repression in Iran in 2019, and also was chair of the Iranian inquiry into the criminal downing of flight PS 752. Was he held accountable for that? No. He was appointed president of Iran. And as president of Iran, who engaged in all this international criminality, and I might add, in a standing incitement to hatred and genocide against the Jewish people and against the Baha'i in Iran, he addressed the UN General Assembly, then was a guest of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. And in the film, you see that we gave the Canadian government a list of 19 architects of repression in Iran to be sanctioned. Happily, most of them finally last year were sanctioned, but not Ibrahim Raisi. And here's the person who is not only the architect of repression, but one of the architects of this metastasizing axis of evil that I mentioned. And the time has come to sanction him and hold him accountable.
Hear, hear. Ambassador?
Just by way of introduction, Irwin and I were members of Parliament together, and it was a great thrill for me to be able to be in the House of Commons with him. We were both in opposition at the time, and it's been a real pleasure working with Irwin on a whole range of issues and continuing to be inspired by him. I don't think this is the only period in time in which there's been major backsliding. I think we can point to other eras in the 20th century when you can see exactly similar things happening. And the harsh fact is that democracy and the commitment to freedom and the commitment to a rule of law that really means something is relatively rare. It's not a global phenomenon. It's in people's hearts, but it's not necessarily in the structures that are around people. We are in a dark moment right now. Of that, there is no doubt whatsoever. And I think the important thing is for us to keep on exposing. And I've taken a lot out of watching the way Irwin has worked. Let me just say some things about Irwin, how he does this. First thing is he is laser focused on an issue and a person. And he will put that person and that issue in the context of a country or in the context of a system, but he will never stop focusing on that person. And somebody should write a book about how he does this, because it's an extraordinary thing as to how he does it. And he is relentless, by the way. As ambassador, I frequently will get text messages that I see have been written from somewhere. They arrive in on my cell phone at 3 o'clock in the morning. Luckily, he doesn't phone at 3 o'clock in the morning. The message is here: I need to talk to you about this, or I need to say to you, you've got to find a way to get this on the agenda. And it's this relentless quality, as well as his wonderful sense of humor, which keeps things going in a positive direction, and which makes a huge difference. And it's also his integrity. And even his, I can't say enemies, but I would say countries with whom he is very, very difficult, and whose record he makes a point of exposing. I've heard one ambassador say to me, we can't get angry with Professor Cotler. I said, why not? Why not? And he said, because he does it to everyone. And I thought that was a good, he recognized the quality. He says, he doesn't single out China or single out Russia or single out anybody. He doesn't let up on any situation where he understands the dynamic behind what is underway. And he's somebody who may not be that well known in the United States, but he should be, because his work and the way in which he's gone about it has ultimately proven to be far more successful than the tactics and the methods that are used by a lot of other people. I can remember meeting Sharansky for the first time. He came into my office when I was the Premier of Ontario, and he looked at me. We were chatting, and the first thing he said to me was, "Do you know Irwin Cotler?" I said, "Yeah, of course I know Irwin Cotler." He said, "He was my lawyer." I said, "Oh, no wonder you got out." Now I understand what happened. Anyway, I'll stop there.
No, thank you. Before we get back to Irwin, Bob, you gave a stirring speech about 6 days ago before the UN Security Council on what's going on from October 7th. I think the audience would benefit hearing a little, and maybe as part of it, you could explain. I know you worked heroically and mightily on this, but you have an unprovoked attack by the governing authority in Gaza that remains unrepudiated. Not denunciated. And so say a few words of what you said in that stirring speech that moved me for one.
Well, what I said was that I think that the makeup of the UN and other forces are at work meant, and that after the attack on October the 7th, I can remember the Speaker of the House of Commons phoned me up, newly elected Greg Fergus. He phoned me up and on the weekend after that day, and he said, "I'm thinking of putting the Israeli flag, the colors of Israel, lighting them up and putting them on the Peace Tower. What do you think?" And I said, "I think you've got about 48 hours to do it. And then there'll be so much pressure not to do it, or to sort of whatever, one side, what about? I said, "So get it done." So he did it. He did it on the Sunday and the Monday, Tuesday. And then they decided they'd made the point. But my point is that the situation is genuinely tragic. I said to people, Israel has a right to self-defense, but Israel also has a right to mourn. And what the world has never done is give Israel the opportunity, the chance to be able to mourn and to get the world to understand exactly what happened. The Secretary General, who is not an unsympathetic person, but he made a major error, because he said, I denounced what happened, etc. And he said, and then he immediately turned, went from bang over. He said, but it didn't happen in a vacuum, which I think was just so totally insensitive, and also just sort of taking one context and not all the other contexts in which you could put this event. And he chose not to do that, which I think was terrible. My point is that because of the way in which Hamas has structured itself, Hamas is not just in Gaza. Hamas is under Gaza. And because of the way in which Hamas is has buried itself into the tunnels underneath Gaza because of the way in which it has basically hidden itself in every major institution of the country: schools, hospitals, camps, houses, apartment buildings, wherever people are living. The entire country is turned into a human shield. And so the reaction to what has happened is the focus on the 7th is lost. And that to me is a true tragedy, because it means that people are forgetting already how is it that this happened, and then replacing it with all the other things it's replaced with, many of which are not true, many of which are false, many of which are just propaganda. And it's tough in the UN right now. What's it like? It's tough because every country that has a stake in belittling Jews, every country that has a stake in defending its authoritarianism, defending its treatment of people, its treatment of their population, is totally delighted that this, Israel finds itself in the situation where fighting back means taking on, from their perspective, a population that has become the victim. And that shift in the sort of momentum in the discussion has created a terrible situation. I mean, when you say the United Nations didn't denounce Hamas, actually, our vote on Friday was 88 to 55, where we insisted that if you're going to have a resolution on what should be done, you have to say this is what happened. And when I moved the motion, some people said, well, it doesn't go far enough. I said, no, I want to make it the simplest motion. It has to say 3 things: Hamas, terror, hostages. And we can talk about all the other things another day, but I want these 3 things in there. And I thought we had a chance. I thought we might be able to get people to say, yeah, you're right. Because there are many parts of the Arab world that privately will tell you they totally agree with what we're saying. It's just that they can't say it publicly because of the momentum that has been established on the other side.
Well, it's heroic what you tried to do, and that sort of causes us to pivot to an issue that you spoke about in the film, Irwin, and that is, the real heroes are the people who go to prison. They do the time. But folks like the 2 of you, both ambassadors here, are hardwired for decency. So it's appropriate at the Museum of Jewish Heritage and the museum I founded, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, we have a phrase, upstander, a proactive, positive force for change. Both of you are those in spades. So the question is, what motivates you, Irwin, to get up at 3 in the morning to do this? Is it your father telling you about the institutions, your mother saying you have to feel injustice, the shadow of Wallenberg? What is it that makes you hardwired for decency?
Well, I think you hit on it, Rick. I mean, the film does open when I make reference. It was my father who taught me when I was too young to understand the profundity of the message, which he would repeat when he would say to me that the pursuit of justice, and he would use the Hebraic tzedek, tzedek tidov, as he would say, was equal to all the other commandments combined. And then he would say, this must be your moral compass. This is what you must teach onto your children. And then, as I said, it was my mother who, when she heard my father saying these things, she said, if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, as she would put it, the pursuit of justice will just be an idle slogan. It'll just be a theoretical abstraction. So as a result of the teachings of my parents, and in high school I went to a Jewish day school, I had several teachers who were themselves Holocaust survivors. They didn't speak of it much then, but it happened when I was in law school, what became my first pro bono client, though my son, if he were here, would joke to say you only had pro bono clients, Dad, was the Association of Survivors of Nazi Oppression. And they not only, would share with me what I've often spoken about, horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened, but they also spoke to me about some of them who were saved of Raoul Wallenberg. And it was back in the 70s that I learned how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act like Raoul Wallenberg can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. And then with the political prisoners that I was involved in, I saw ongoing Raoul Wallenbergs in my life. That's how I see Anatoly Sharansky. That's how I saw Nelson Mandela. And I got involved as a student in the two great human rights struggles of the second half of the 20th century. Here too, influenced and inspired by the person who became my initial mentor, teacher, colleague, close friend, Nobel Peace Laureate and Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel, who probably outside my parents was the most transformative impact on my life. And it was through these inspirational individuals, as I mentioned, Sharansky, Mandela, but before that with the movements themselves, that I got involved with these two great human rights struggles, the struggle for human rights in former Soviet Union and the struggle against apartheid, both as a student in the 70s, and then got involved with the people who were the face, the vision, the voice of those struggles, Sharansky and Mandela. And I began to see how political prisoners, like those two, like Raoul Wallenberg, who was also a political prisoner and disappeared in the Gulag, how these people were able to transform history. And so I said to myself, we're living in a free world, living in a peaceful community like Canada. The least I can do is to try to be involved in helping the case and cause of the Sharanskys, the Mandelas, the Nasrin Sotoudehs, and others. And so after Parliament, after having been a law professor and been in Parliament, we founded the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights for the reasons you can appreciate. And the best thing about it is that I'm working with a fantastic group of young people, represented here this evening by Brandon Silver. If I say he's our Director of Policy and Projects, it's an understatement. I mean, he is co-chair of the largest civil society coalition with regard to Magnitsky sanctions. He's involved in the International Panel for Media Freedom. And last week, and the first few days this week, helped organize a very important visit to Washington last week and Ottawa this week of the families of the hostages. And I have to tell you that I was revisiting that phrase that I mentioned about horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened, when I heard their testimony. You know, one of the cruel ironies is that these families of the hostages and those who were murdered were all amongst the peace activists in Israel. They were the ones who were at the forefront of the peace movement. They're the ones who were working with Gaza Palestinians. Right now, one of the hostages is Vivian Silver, whose son was with us in Ottawa, from Winnipeg. I know her for over 50 years. She is the personification of what a peace activist is all about. And we have gotten a mandate from the families of Nir Oz. Nir Oz is a kibbutz, also right on the southern Israel, on the Gaza border. It's a kibbutz of 400 persons. More than 25% of them were murdered or taken hostage. As we meet, 78 of them have been taken hostage. They include babies. They include children. And elderly and disabled and Holocaust survivors. In fact, when we were in Washington, the representative of the family of hostages from the kibbutz, Noam Perry, was with us. Her father is one of those abducted, son of a Holocaust survivor. What I'm saying is the pain and the pathos when they were sharing their testimony last week and today, each time I heard it, the utter brutality of Hamas's mass atrocities, as I say, things too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. These are heroic people. And one of the things that we have been saying at this point, and the most important thing in that regard, is that the whole question of the release, the unconditional and immediate release of the hostages, has to be seen as a humanitarian imperative of the first order, as a moral imperative, because it's anchored in the principle of humanity, as a legal imperative, because every day that these hostages are forcibly disappeared people in detention is an ongoing and standing crime against humanity, and an international imperative, because it's a responsibility of the international community and the states parties to do everything with a sense of urgency to secure the release of these hostages. And when I say hostages, I have to just add one thing, and it's Bob's remarks that reminded me to mention this. It's not only the Jews that have been taken hostage. It's that Hamas keeps the Palestinian people hostage. Hamas is not just an enemy of the Jewish people. It's an enemy of the Palestinian people. It's an enemy of peace. It's an enemy of our common humanity. And here's where the impunity comes in, and with this I close. That Hamas is not just a terrorist organization prohibited under Canadian law and American law. It's an anti-Semitic, genocidal terrorist organization. Not because I say so, but because they say so in their charter. And they've been able to do so since 1988 with that sense of impunity, and be welcomed and have base and sanctuary in Qatar and Turkey, their enablers and the like. So there is this axis of evil with Iran, etc., that the Hamas reflects and represents, and that's why this is a larger struggle here that is going on, and Bob has expressed it most compellingly, as Rick has mentioned, in his interventions at the UN.
Thank you, Irwin. Bob, speak a moment about what motivates you to be an upstander and all that you've done in your long career of public service.
Well, you mentioned a lot of good qualities about Brandon, but from the movie, he's also a geographer. Like,
or a compass.
Give this guy a compass. Tell him to get off the iPhone. I'm only kidding with Brandon. I was also very influenced by my parents. My father was a diplomat, but he was a different kind of diplomat. My father, the full story is this: my father's father was born Goodman Cohen, and he was the eldest son in a family that was in Lithuania, and they left Lithuania in the 1890s in the pogroms, and they went to Scotland. And when he came to Scotland, he fell in love with a Scottish girl, which was in those years like not what was supposed to happen. And so he and his wife, my grandmother, went to Canada, and eventually Goodman Cohen became William Ray, which was my grandmother's name. And so my father was born Saul Ray. And somebody said to me once, well, you know, did your father conceal the fact that he was Jewish? I said, his name was Saul, S-A-U-L, Ray. Not sure if you were going to conceal something, that would be the first thing you'd think of. But he had a wonderful sense of humor, and he was a musician. And I've tried to keep up that side of my family's tradition. My mother was English. My parents were married in the States, but they met in England just before the war. My father was doing his PhD, and as the war was breaking out, they came back to North America, and so I grew up in this. My father was employed as a diplomat from the time he was 24 years old, and he retired when he was 65. So he was 40 years plus in the Canadian Foreign Service, and my parents taught me a lot of things. My father, I was, you'll be surprised to learn this, but I was sort of a smart alecky kid and thought I knew everything. And at one point I was saying something about somebody else, some figure on the news. And he looked at me and he said, just remember how little you really know about that person. And just remember that everyone you meet is going through a struggle of some kind. And compassion is a much more important quality than intelligence. This is my father told me this. Now, mind you, when I bring home my report card, he wasn't impressed if it wasn't, like very good, on all sides. And he had a wonderful way about him. He was a very natural person with people from all walks of life. And he was present at the UN when it was going through the world was going through the transformation of decolonization, where African countries and Asian countries were coming into the United Nations. And I said, how's it going? He said, it's great. The place has changed. It's wonderful. Everybody's here. It's so much better than when it was a small group. Now it's a big group. Everybody's here. It's chaos. It's difficult. Huge arguments, but it's much, much better that way. My mother was extremely wise and a very loving person. So I think those things have stayed with me my whole life. I've had the advantage of many mentors. Irwin probably wouldn't consider himself to be, but he is, because I'm so much younger than he is. I've tried to do a couple of things, which I still try to do. One is stay curious, like never stop learning and listening. And the second one is not to be afraid to speak out. And I think that is something that I've had that quality for a long time. And I think it's important. It's often not appreciated in the job I do now, because diplomacy, you're supposed to be, quiet diplomacy, right? You're not supposed to say anything. And I'll just say, look, this isn't this is that. I mean, I said, how can you have a resolution on the conflict that's happening now in Gaza and not mention Hamas? It's like talking about Moby Dick as if it's not a white whale. Like, you got to talk about the thing that's right there in front of you. And I believe in that. I believe in doing that. And I think frankly, I think our failure to do that, the fact that we don't we often live in environments where truth telling is not to be encouraged, is a bad thing. One of my daughters has this quality, because when I was in politics, Americans won't know this, but I was the premier of a province. It was like being governor of New York, and we could tell from what was coming that I was going to lose the election. And I had 3 daughters, quite young, in school, and we were having breakfast one morning, and I said, kids, I want you to know that, that I'm been the premier, I've been at this, I know, but it's possible, it's just possible that we might lose the election. And my middle daughter, Lisa, said, Dad, hasn't anybody told you? You're toast. Like, we'll still love you, but you're done.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me ask a couple other quick questions, and I think we have some audience questions too. So briefly, let's talk about in the film the metastasizing of evil through the canary and the coal mine, anti-Semitism. I'm reminded of the poem by Father Niemöller. First they came for the trade unionists. I wasn't one. I didn't stand up. Then they came for the communists. Then they came for the Jews. Then there was no one left to speak. So the two of you comment briefly on how this unprecedented anti-Semitism today. Indeed, the FBI director testifying before Congress said that the Jewish population in the United States represents, I believe, 2.4% of the country, yet more than 60% of the hate crimes emanate related to Jews. Comment, both of you, briefly. Or either one of you.
Want me to start? I think the mistake I made growing up was thinking, and I don't think I was alone in this, and that anti-Semitism was a phenomenon of Europe that, and in part in America and Canada. My parents told me stories about challenges and issues and things that they faced and things that they saw, clubs that they didn't want to apply to because they knew they wouldn't get in. But my view was that the Holocaust, it was such a catastrophe, such a huge, enormous catastrophe, that it was over, and fundamentally we would move beyond that. And I think what I've learned, and obviously it seems kind of stupid saying this, but I think it needs to be kind of stated, is that as you study history more and really get into the last 2,000 years, understand what's been happening and what's still happening, it is that actually no, anti-Semitism is actually a chronic disease. It's not a catastrophic illness. It's a chronic disease. It's been there for a very, very, very long time, and it underlies a great many cultures, a great many situations. And you read Simon Schama or other great sort of understanding of how it's come and gone. You are gone and simmered down, then simmers up again. You realize that it is just a very old and deep hatred in a lot of different cultures and religions. I mean, there's Christian anti-Semitism, and there's Russian cultural anti-Semitism, obviously German anti-Semitism, but there's also Muslim anti-Semitism. It's in the Quran. It's in a lot of different places. It's in the Bible, in the New Testament. So it's just there. And it doesn't take much to light the match and get the dry. It's the sort of the dry grass that people can then turn to very, very quickly, to the point where my wife, who's Jewish, my wife said to me the other night, this is now the first time that I've felt fear, and I feel fear. I'm not sure of what could happen. And it has to do with the atmosphere in the United Nations. I mean, I've heard speeches that were pretty bad. I don't go on the internet as much as I used to because it's just so much junk out there that you just don't know when it's going to hit and how it's going to hit. And it's deeply it's agonizing, I think, for people to realize it. But there it is. So we need to understand that it's not a historical phenomenon or a marginal phenomenon. It's deep. It's deep inside a great many cultures and a great many places, and we have to keep the fight. The fight is still on. The fight is not over. The fight is still there. We have to keep naming it. Somebody said to me the other day that your tactic in moving the amendment. This was an ambassador from another country. Said your tactic was sinister. I said, what? First of all, it wasn't a tactic. It was what I really believe. What was sinister about it? He said, well, somehow I think the Israelis were involved. I said, you got to be kidding me. Like, what are you talking about? It's just like, yeah, it's just bizarre. But it's just sort of, no, it's just, that's not the way things work. And that's not, what motivates people. But I have in a funny way, I've experienced, I'm not Jewish myself, and yet because of my background and my foreground, my kids are, and so on, you sort of, people say, well, you feel it, and you get the anti-Semitism occasionally, but it's just a bizarre, deeply felt phenomenon that erupts every once in a while, and then it simmers down. But obviously it erupts with people getting killed in synagogues and all the horrendous things that are happening. And I think the other thing that worries me about the madness of crowds is what I see. I see kids on campus now. I see this, and people on the street and waving the flags and from the river to the sea, and you sort of say, "What the hell are you?" And like, what would make you think that that's? And it's very hard to have a debate or discussion. Say no. I mean, it's like, I don't know whether I can even go on campus anymore. I mean, it's crazy. It's just, it's come
College
on.
campuses have gotten worse,
crazy.
Worse than ever.
Crazy.
Irwin, what would you add?
Yeah, I just concluded my 3 years as special envoy for preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism, and been reflecting upon it. And I actually, join with what Bob said, in that, anti-Semitism is not only the oldest, longest, most enduring, most toxic and lethal of hatreds, but it's one that mutates and metastasizes over time. But it's anchored in one I would call foundational, generic, historical, and contemporary trope, the mother of all tropes, as I call it. And that is Jews, the Jewish people, Israel is a Jew among the nations, as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. And it reflects whatever is the particular zeitgeist at any given moment in time. So when the zeitgeist was religion or the Christian religion, so the Jews were held to be guilty of deicide. Contemporary application, Jews will not replace us. When you had the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, the Jews were held to be the poisoners of the wells. Contemporary application, that the Jews, the Jewish people, Israel, manufactured the COVID virus, caused its spread, and yet another trope profited from it. And then came a very important development, which went almost unknown, but then began to be indulged. And it was in the 70s, and I was a lobfester at the time, and I sensed it. And that was when we had the beginning of the human rights revolution, as it was called in the 70s. That's at the same time, though it went unnoticed, the Jewish people, Israel, were held out to be the new geopolitical antichrist of our time. And so we went from traditional anti-Semitism, discrimination against the denial of assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in any society they inhabit, to the new anti-Semitism being the discrimination against denial of assault upon the rights of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. What was common to both, traditional and new, was discrimination. All that had happened is that moved from discrimination against Jews as individuals to the discrimination against Jews as a people, and then reverberating back against Jews as individuals. And then you had the tipping point. All this was evolving, being indulged, etc. You had the tipping point of the World Conference Against Racism and Hate in Durban, South Africa, in 2001. Now, I have to say, when it was first announced that it was going to be this conference in the late 90s, I celebrated it. This was going to be the first human rights conference of the 21st century. Its theme was going to be anti-racism, and it was taking place in Durban, South Africa, the birthplace of apartheid. And then I became a member of the Canadian delegation. I was excited about the prospect of being there. And what happened at Durban was that a world conference against racism and hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. And I'll never forget it. Durban has been embedded in my memory, even in my psyche, and just was in reference was made to the Lantos Prize. That's where Tom Lantos was the head of the American delegation, walked out on it and said he never experienced such a hate festival in his life. And as a Holocaust survivor, he was like seeing it all over again. Now, I flew back to Montreal on September 10th in the evening. I woke up to 9/11, as here you experience it in New York. And later that day, a colleague of mine called from South Africa who had been at that conference, a Jewish lawyer, and said to me words I never forgot. He said, you know, that 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, but Durban was the Mein Kampf. In other words, it was this metastasizing of hate. It's gone on for the last 20 years. You had a second tipping point with May 2021, the Hamas war. And as I shared with our prime minister just before what happened now in Israel, when I shared my principal findings, none of them are all well known. It's repeated all over, that we're witnessing the highest rise in anti-Semitism since audits began in 50 years ago. Yet a dramatic spike now with Hamas. That hate crimes, and it was mentioned in Canada, Canadian Jews, 1% of the population, 67% of all religiously motivated hate crimes. And I can go on with all the statistical data, etc. But I'll close with one thing, because that's the thing that I found most disturbing. The most disturbing thing I found was our traditional paradigm of combating anti-Semitism was combat anti-Semitism from the far right, the far left, and radical Islam. What I found, and I think this is the precursor to what we're witnessing now and the explosion and incendiary anti-Semitism, apart from the social media which incentivize it, the most disturbing finding I found was the increasing normalizing, mainstreaming, legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture, the popular culture, the entertainment culture, the sports culture, the media culture, and in particular in the campus culture. And we ignored the historical lesson, and still ignored, that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies. It's an assault on our common humanities. You mentioned it's the canary in the mine shaft of global evil. It's not just threatening to Jews, it's threatening to all of us. And that's why we have a common responsibility here to combat it.
I agree. One last question, and then I'm going to adapt to audience questions, and we'll close the program. Briefly, Irwin, the Magnitsky. You can't ask that. Okay, well, only for the sympathy of the audience.
I'll tell you what my son said. He says, Dad, don't give us your 10 points. It's a new generation. After 2 points, we're out of here.
Well, I would have asked Brandon this if he was on the panel instead of Bill Browder. Magnitsky, what are the next major frontiers? Briefly, you know, is it Iran? Is it Saudi Arabia?
I'm going to let Brandon answer it. He's here. Come on. Very briefly on it is that we went from originally Magnitsky sanctioning Russia, of course, as a major human rights violator. It's now the globalization of Magnitsky sanctions. And I think that it's an important resource. And if it's going to be effective, it's, we're targeting, as said in the film, individuals. And it has to be a twofold process to secure justice for the victims, accountability for the major human rights violators, and we have to go after those major human rights violators wherever they are. That's what Magnitsky sanctions are all about.
You're here. So one of the audience questions is something I was going to ask to close, and I'm going to ask Bob one part and Irwin the other, sort of the bad and the ugly, the despair and the hope. So on the despair, and Bob, you can also comment on the hope part. Irwin adverted to it earlier. I believe tomorrow or November 2nd, Iran is going to become chair of this Human Rights Council in the UN. And I guess my question is, I think it's kind of an Orwellian inversion. How do we begin to combat that through effective leaders like you in the UN?
Well, I think you call it. I think it makes the United Nations a much more combative place than some people are comfortable with. But I think it has to be, because you can't let this happen. I mean, I spoke out against when we took Iran off the Human Rights Council. Somebody said to me, "It's never been done before." I said, "So what?" So they said, "Well, there's no provision for it." I said, "Good, and we'll make it up. We'll just do it," and we did. And that's what you got to do. You just got to call them out. Look, I mean, the UN has the misfortune of being a club that anybody can get into. It is not an organization whose membership is based on meeting certain standards or you're just a country. You can be any kind of country. You're a member of the United Nations. And so people often blame the UN for whatever. And I say, well, it's not just the UN organization or a spokesman, the UN Secretary General, can say something you disagree with. But the reality is most of the challenges facing the UN are the membership of the United Nations, which means countries are taking this position. It's not like the UN is taking this position. It's the countries in the world are taking this position, which in some ways makes it even more challenging. And when we look at the world, we see that autocracy, very aggressive forms of nationalism are on the ascendant, and that is what we're facing. And the question becomes, well, what do we do about it? And my answer is, democracies have to wake up, have to recognize this is what's happening, and then have to start to build the institutions in common and together and in real ways that show that we know what we're doing. But we also need to understand that these forces that we say are out there are also inside our countries. Now, I didn't come here to talk about your country. I'll talk about my country. My country, you can see the growth of a kind of populism, a kind of way of just sort of lining up us versus them, communicating in very demagogic ways, and seeing this is how you do politics, and that's very, very dangerous. Very dangerous for everybody.
In this country too.
Yeah, well, I'll let you say that because I can't.
Well, this subject for another day.
But the reason that I have hope is because we're on the right side, and it is the path of truth, and it is the path of justice and of goodness, and it doesn't always win in the short run, but we certainly aspire to the thought that it wins in the long run. And my final point is, the trouble with despair is it prevents you from seeing the opportunities to do good things, which is what I think Irwin is teaching us. Is that what's the point of despairing? Once you figure out how you can actually win this thing, get this prisoner released, get this situation changed, get this legislation passed. Once you do that, you can get somewhere. But if you despaired and said, doesn't matter, if you become cynical, doesn't matter, then you've given in to the bad guys and you don't have a hope in hell of succeeding. You have to have a degree of positivity and optimism, or you haven't got a chance of accomplishing anything.
Irwin, what gives you hope, sir?
What gives me hope, is when I see the kind of leadership that Bob Rae displayed that resulted in Russia being defeated in its candidacy for the UN Human Rights Council. So when we have a major, criminal aggressor state like Russia, it got defeated. So when we mobilize and when we have a Bob Rae to lead that mobilization, it shows what effective moral political leadership can do. And the larger reason that fits into it that I'm optimistic and I end with hope is because whatever 2023 may be, it's not 1943. That there is a Jewish state today as an antidote to Jewish powerlessness. That there is a Jewish people today with untold intellectual, moral, political resources. And I'm encouraged by the younger generation with whom I work, that I encounter, and they are the foot soldiers, and they inspire me every day. And finally, that there are non-Jews in political leadership, like President Joe Biden, who's shown what moral leadership is all about in the manner in which he's called out Hamas' sheer evil, sheer brutality, as he's called it. So we do have that kind of moral leadership. I was encouraged when I saw most of the leaders at the G7 did go and visit Israel and gave expression, of support in that regard. And again, with those I work with, phrase used, upstanders. There are upstanders, non-Jewish upstanders that are there and are prepared to stand up and be counted. So I close by saying that at times such as these, qui s'excuse, s'accuse, that whoever remains indifferent indicts himself or herself. And so if we're not indifferent and we're engaged and we're in the trenches in the struggle for human rights, at the end of the day will prevail. And I believe, as Martin Luther King said, we can bend the arc of history towards justice.
From your mouth. And on that note, let me just say on a personal comment about Irwin, because I think it's worth saying, and then we'll close. And that is, I was with Irwin at these meetings last week with the hostages in Washington, but I also saw not only people like Brandon Silver, but I met your daughter, who is the Israeli special envoy for anti-Semitism. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I met the Canadian ambassador to the United States, your colleague, who's a former student of yours. That gives us all hope. So it's on that note. There may be other questions that you may want to come up, but I want to first thank our wonderful panelists, Ambassador Cotler, Ambassador Rae, and I want to thank Jack and Sydney and Josh and the Museum of Jewish Heritage for making this program possible. Thank you, and go home safe.
And thank you, Rick. Thank you for convening us.